Good morning, friends. Welcome to another episode of Sutta Study with Bhante Suddhaso. So this morning we will be studying the second part of the Caṅki Sutta. Yesterday we studied the first part, and tomorrow we'll go through the third part. And you can find the sutta right here. We put a link. And welcome to Michael Jens, who says, thank you for your talk last night, Bhante. It was very helpful. And welcome to Lilia, Mark, Ella, Melia, and Gita. And of course, welcome to Bhante. I'll pass it on to him so we can start.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Good morning, friends. So we'll pick up where we left off. So we were about a third of the way through the sutta. And the Brahmin Caṅki had just explained to the other Brahmins why it was proper for the Brahmin Caṅki to go to see the Buddha. So picking up at that point, the sutta says, then the Brahmin Caṅki approached the Buddha together with a large group of Brahmins and conversed with him. After the appropriate polite conversation was finished, he sat to one side. On this occasion, the Blessed One was seated there after having engaged in some polite speech with several elderly Brahmins. So apparently some other Brahmins were already there, speaking with the Buddha. And the sutta says, there was also a young 16-year-old student with a shaven head named Kapatika seated in the assembly. He was a master of the 3 Vedas, including all 5 of its divisions. He knew words and phrases, philosophy, and all the characteristics of great people. He interrupted the conversation that the elderly Brahmins were having with the Blessed One. So this is interesting here in that, so there's this group of elderly Brahmins conversing with the Buddha, but there was also this young teenage Brahmin student who apparently was very studious fellow in that he was thoroughly familiar with the Brahmin scriptures. And he was also trying to get in on the conversation, which of course is a little bit rude. And there's also the implication here, the Buddha was speaking with these elderly experienced Brahmins, and then there's this young inexperienced fellow who keeps trying to butt in on the conversation. So it says, then the Blessed One rebuked the student Kapatika, saying, Venerable Bharadvaja should not interrupt the elderly Brahmin's conversation. He should wait until the conversation is finished. So just to clear one point here, so Bharadvaja was probably Kapatika's family name, the name of his clan. So Bharadvaja is a name that we see many, many places in the suttas. As being one of the major family names for Brahmin families. So his name was Kapatika, but the Buddha refers to him by his family name, Bharadvaja. So it's kind of like John Smith, and the Buddha refers to him as Mr. Smith rather than as John. So the Buddha says, Venerable Bharadvaja should not interrupt the elderly Brahmin's conversation. He should wait until the conversation is finished. When this was said, the Brahmin Caṅki said to the Blessed One, Sir Gotama should not rebuke the student Kapatika. The student Kapatika is a gentleman, very learned, wise, and a good speaker. He is able to participate in the discussion with the Blessed One. Then the Blessed One thought, most likely the student Kapatika's statements will be about the Brahmin scriptures of the 3 sciences. This is why the Brahmins respect him. So again, it's interesting here, after the Brahmin Caṅki went through all that effort explaining why the Buddha was so respectable and why the Brahmin should go to see him. Then when they actually get to see the Buddha, the very first thing the Brahmin Caṅki does is rebuke the Buddha because the Buddha was telling this teenage boy to stop interrupting the conversation. So I find this highly amusing. Again, the rationale that's given is like, well, this student has learned his lessons well. He's very familiar with the Brahmin scriptures. So the sutta says, then the student Kapatika thought, when the contemplative Gotama looks at my eyes, I will ask him a question. The Blessed One read the student Kapatika's mind and looked at his eyes. Then the student Kapatika thought, the contemplative Gotama is paying attention to me. Perhaps I will ask him a question. Then he said to the Blessed One, Sir Gotama, regarding the mantras, aphorisms, and scriptures of the ancient Brahmins, contemporary Brahmins arrive at the definite conclusion. Only this is true, everything else is false. What does Sir Gotama say about this? In other words, Kapatika is saying we have these scriptures which are passed down to us from through the Brahmanic tradition from the ancient Brahmins, and we believe them to be absolutely true. And anything which contradicts them or is different from them, we believe to be false. So he's asking, what does the Buddha feel about this? How does the Buddha feel about the Brahmin scriptures and the claim that the Brahmins have for the absolute authority of the Brahmin scriptures? And the Buddha replies, Bharadvaja, is there even one Brahmin among all Brahmins who says, I know this, I see this, only this is true, everything else is false? In other words, the Buddha is saying, is there any Brahmin currently alive who has direct personal experience of the absolute truth of the teachings in the Brahmin scriptures? So in other words, someone who's not just relying on faith or tradition, but who has direct understanding. So for example, I've never been to Russia, but I have a certain amount of faith that Russia exists. In fact, a friend of mine even claims he's from Russia. He even claims he has other family members who come from Russia. This might actually be true. However, since I've never actually been to Russia, I do not know Russia for myself. I have not seen it for myself. So to some extent, I cannot say with absolute complete certainty that Russia really exists. I think it's extremely likely, but I can't say with absolute certainty through personal experience that Russia is real. So similarly, the Buddha is saying, okay, so you've got some scriptures and you have faith in them. That's great. Do you know anybody who has direct personal experience of what those scriptures are talking about, such that they can confidently say that only the teachings in the Brahmin scriptures are true and everything else is wrong? And Kapatika replies, certainly not, Sir Gotama. So Kapatika clearly states, he's like, no, actually, I'm not aware of any Brahmin who has direct personal knowledge of these religious teachings. And the Buddha asks, Bharadvaja, is there even a single teacher of the Brahmins, or a teacher's teacher, as far back as 7 generations of teachers, who says, I know this, I see this, only this is true, everything else is false? In other words, he's saying, well, okay, maybe the current generation doesn't quite get it. Maybe the current generation is a bit disappointing, but maybe their teachers or the teachers of their teachers in back 7 generations, maybe somebody in this line of teachers, maybe one of them had direct personal experience of the Brahmanical beliefs. And Kapatika says, well, actually, no, there's no record of that. So then the Buddha asked, Bharadvaja, the Brahmins of the past who invented and taught the mantras which were sung, recited, and collected of old, and which are now still sung, spoken, repeated, and taught, namely Attika, Vamaka, Vamadeva, Vesamita, Yamatagi, Angirasa, Bharadvaja, Vaseta, Kassapa, and Bhagu. So these were several legendary Brahmins of the distant past. The Buddha says, did they say, I know this, I see this, only this is true, everything else is false? So in other words, the Buddha is asking, did even the legendary Brahmins of old claim to have had direct personal experience of the Brahmanic scriptures? And Kapatika replies, certainly not, Sir Gautama. And so then the Buddha says, so Bharadvaja, it seems that there is not even one Brahmin among all Brahmins who says, I know this, I see this, only this is true, everything else is false. There's not even a single teacher of the Brahmins or a teacher's teacher, as far back as 7 generations of teachers, who says, I know this, I see this, only this is true, everything else is false. And not even the Brahmins of the past who invented and taught the mantras which were sung, recited, and collected of old, and which are now still sung, spoken, repeated, and taught, namely Attika, Vamaka, Vamadeva, Vesamita, Yamatagi, Angirasa, Bharadvaja, Vaseta, Kassapa, and Bhagu, said, I know this, I see this, only this is true, everything else is false. And the Buddha says, Bharadvaja, it is like a line of blind people, each one holding the next. The first one does not see, the middle one does not see, the last one does not see. In the same way, Bharadvaja, it seems to me that the statements of the Brahmins are like a line of blind people. The first one does not see, the middle one does not see, and the last one does not see. What do you think, Bharadvaja? Since this is so, isn't the faith of the Brahmins baseless? So I find this incredibly amusing. So the Buddha is saying, okay, so you have faith in these scriptures, even though you don't have any experience of them. Your teachers also didn't have any experience of them. In fact, nobody, going all the way back to the legendary Brahmins of old, had personal experience of any of these teachings. So what on earth do you have faith in these things for? Again, it's like a line of blind people. You're currently blind, and you're following the blind people in front of you, and they are just following the blind people in front of them. So a line of blind people, it doesn't do anybody any good. So here the Buddha is pointing to the uselessness of blind belief, the utter absurdity of blind faith. So this is faith without personal experience, faith without direct experience. He said it's like a line of blind people. So the student Kapatika changes track here. He says, Sir Gautama, the Brahmins here do not rely only on faith. They also rely on oral tradition. And it's like, well, okay, I don't actually see how that's any better. I actually find it quite strange that Kapatika thought that this would be a useful direction to take. If the Buddha just dismantled faith, then why would he think oral tradition would be any better? So, but this also indicates this idea. It's like, well, if we are accurately receiving the traditional teachings, memorizing them properly, and teaching them to others, and if this has been going on for hundreds of years, thousands of years, each person accurately receiving and transmitting the traditional teachings, then in theory, at some point, there was somebody who knew what they were talking about, and it's been preserved and handed down through the oral tradition. So there's still an element of faith there, and that one has to have faith that at some point, there was somebody who knew what they were talking about. And that's what gives validity to the entire oral tradition. So the Buddha says, Bharadvaja, previously you went on faith, now you claim oral tradition. So the Buddha is not terribly impressed either. He says, Bharadvaja, there are 5 things which can have 2 different results here and now. What 5? Faith, preference, oral tradition, logical thought, and approval of a viewpoint based on contemplation. Bharadvaja, these are 5 things which can have 2 different results here and now. So he's saying these are 5 bases for confidence, 5 bases for religious belief. So faith, preference, oral tradition, logical thought, and approval based on contemplation. So 5 bases for logical thought. And for those who are familiar with a number of the other suttas, this may remind you of the Kalama Sutta. And there is a certain overlap here with the Kalama Sutta. The Kalama Sutta gives a list of 10, which is a bit more comprehensive, but it's covering a similar concept. So I went over the Kalama Sutta a few weeks ago, and I think you can still find the recording if you're interested. So the Buddha says, these are 5 things which can have 2 different results here and now. And he goes through each one. He says, Bharadvaja, one may have strong faith in something, and yet it turns out to be meaningless, hollow, and wrong. Or one may not have strong faith in something, yet it turns out to be accurate, precise, and unerring. One may have a strong preference for something. You might really like it. And yet it turns out to be meaningless, hollow, and wrong. For example, I'd really like to believe that I could survive on cheesecake alone. However, as much as I might like that, I actually don't. That sounds awful. I would get sick after a few days. But it might sound like a great idea, but that doesn't mean it's true. Or someone I know just likes to believe that his energy will blend with the universe when he dies. Well, just because you like something doesn't make it true. And the Buddha says, or one may not have a strong preference for something, yet it turns out to be accurate, precise, and unerring. And similarly with the others, one may have received a strong oral tradition about something, and yet it turns out to be meaningless, hollow, and wrong. Or one may not have received a strong oral tradition about something, and yet it turns out to be accurate, precise, and unerring. One may have a strong basis of logical thought about something, and yet it turns out to be meaningless, hollow, and wrong. It's called Western philosophy. Or one may not have a strong basis of logical thought about something, and yet it turns out to be accurate, precise, and unerring. So in other words, just because something seems logical doesn't mean it's true. So we can't rely just upon logical thought either. And finally, he says, one may have strong approval of something based on contemplation, and yet it turns out to be meaningless, hollow, and false. Or one may not have strong approval of a viewpoint based on contemplation, yet it turns out to be accurate, precise, and unerring. So here, it's worth explaining a little bit this term, approval based on contemplation. Let me just find the Pali here. So the Pali is Nijjhana Caṅki, or Ditti Nijjhana Caṅki. So Ditti means viewpoint or opinion or perspective. Nijjhana. Nijjhana, it's actually from the same word as jhana, but here Nijjhana seems to have the meaning of focusing your mind on something, contemplating something, concentrating on a concept or an idea. So it's not referring to samadhi in the sense of stilling the mind, but rather continually rolling the mind around something, contemplating something carefully, considering something closely. So there is the implication here of meditating on something. And then Caṅki means to accept, to tolerate, to approve of something. So Ditti Nijjhana Caṅki then is approval of something based upon contemplation, based upon contemplating it or meditating on it. And so this also comes up where somebody, maybe they sit down to do some meditation and they have an epiphany and they think, now I've got it all figured out. Or they think about something, they roll it around in their mind and then they come to some conclusion. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's true. You may have some intuitive epiphany, but that intuitive epiphany is just a bunch of nonsense and junk in your subconscious mind. Doesn't mean it's true. Similarly, you may contemplate something, consider something, and yet it still winds up being inaccurate. It's based on misinformation, or the process you're applying is not accurate, or you're not bringing enough into consideration, or it's just the limitations of our viewpoints. It's the limitations of our experience that keeps us from seeing the whole picture. So the Buddha is saying none of these 5 things are enough. And so he says next, Bharadvaja, for a sensible person who is a protector of truth, these are not sufficient reasons to arrive at a definite conclusion that only this is true, everything else is false. So here the Buddha introduces kind of the keynote concept of this sutta, which is protecting truth. So the Pali for this is Satchanurakkhana. So anurakkhana means protecting, guarding, and satcha is truth. So how can one protect the truth? How does one guard the truth? How does one preserve the truth? So the Buddha says, for a sensible person who is a protector of truth, these are not sufficient reasons to arrive at a definite conclusion that only this is true, everything else is false. In other words, if we really care about the truth, we really care about protecting and preserving and upholding the truth, then we can't say that something is true just because we have faith in it, or just because we like it, or just because it's traditional, or just because it's logical, or just because we've had some meditative realization of it, related to it. So then Kapatika asks, Sir Gautama, how is one a protector of truth? How does one protect truth? We asked Sir Gautama about protecting truth. Note, by the way, that there's a shift in the tone of Kapatika's statements. So previously, Kapatika was coming from this very strong angle of like, we've got the correct scriptures and we believe that it's absolutely true. How do you feel? And the Buddha's like, no. And so now Kapatika is saying, well, you're talking about protecting truth. And you've said a bunch of stuff which makes a lot of sense, thoroughly dismantling Kapatika's basis of faith. So Kapatika says, well, what do you think is the basis for protecting truth? What do you think allows one to uphold and preserve the truth? And the Buddha replies, Bharadvaja, if it is a person's faith, then if they say, this is my faith, then that statement protects truth. But it is not a sufficient reason to say, only this is true, everything else is false. So, in other words, if you really believe the world is flat, you should not say the world is flat. You can say, I have faith that the world is flat. That's a true statement. Saying the world is flat may or may not be a true statement. It's not true. The world is not flat. Saying the world is flat is not protecting truth. Saying, I have faith that the world is flat, that would be a completely undeniably true statement. Similarly, he says, Bharadvaja, if it is a person's preference, then if they say, this is my preference, then that statement protects truth, but it is not a sufficient reason to say, only this is true, everything else is false. Similarly, it's like, well, I really like to believe that everything is one, so that's what I believe, because it's what I like. Again, that's a valid statement. It's a completely true statement. It might prove that you've got a lot to learn. It might prove that you're phenomenally delusional, but it's still a completely true statement. Next, he says, Bharadvaja, if it is a person's oral tradition, then if they say, this is my oral tradition, then that statement protects truth. But it is not a sufficient reason to say, only this is true, everything else is false. Bharadvaja, if it is a person's logical thought, then if they say, this is my logical thought, then that statement protects truth. But it is not a sufficient reason to say, only this is true, everything else is false. And finally, if it is a person's approval based on contemplation, then if they say, this is my approval based on contemplation, then that statement protects truth. But it is not a sufficient reason to say, only this is true, everything else is false. So he says, Bharadvaja, in this way there is protecting truth. In this way one protects truth. In this way we indicate protecting truth. However, this is not yet awakening to truth. So here the Buddha is making a distinction. He's making a distinction between protecting the truth and awakening to the truth. So he's saying, if you just say, well, I have faith in this, or I like this, or I approve of this, well, you're protecting the truth in that you're not claiming something is true without knowing for sure. But you also have not yet come to realize what actually is true. You're just stating why you believe in something, but you don't yet know what truth actually is. So I think I'll read one more section and then we'll pause for the day. So then Kapatika says, Sir Gotama, in this way there is protecting truth. In this way one protects truth. In this way we see protecting truth. In other words, Kapatika is like, okay, I'm with you. I understand what you're saying. I'm catching what you're throwing down. It's like, I'm getting this. He says, Sir Gotama, how is there awakening to truth? How does one awaken to truth? We ask Sir Gotama about awakening to truth. And the Buddha replies, Here Bharadvaja, a monk lives dependent upon a particular village or town. A householder or his child approaches him, as in the child of the householder, not the child of the monk, approaches him and examines him to see if he has three kinds of mind states. Mind states based on greed, mind states based on aversion, and mind states based on delusion. They look to see if that venerable's mind is overcome by mind states based on greed, such that when not knowing, he says, I know. When not seeing, he says, I see. And he encourages others to do things that lead to their long-term detriment and unhappiness. When examining him in this way, they know this venerable's mind is not overcome by mind states based on greed, such that when not knowing, he would say, I know, etc. This venerable's physical conduct and verbal conduct are that of a person who is free of greed. The Dhamma that this venerable teaches is profound, hard to see, hard to awaken to, peaceful, sublime, outside the domain of thought, subtle, to be experienced by the wise. This Dhamma is not easy for a greedy person to teach. So this is, here the Buddha is introducing, first off, the seeking of a teacher and how one can determine whether or not somebody is a valid teacher. So the first principle that he's introducing is, well, before you can accept teachings from somebody, you first need to check to see, are they filled with greed, hatred, and delusion? Are their minds defiled in such a way that they might say they know something that they don't really know? That they might say they have direct knowledge of something which they don't. So the first thing is actually examining the moral purity of someone, examining their conduct, examining their attitudes and behaviors, and using that to try to deduce to what degree is their mind pure. So the first thing is checking for greed, seeing if they're free from greed, the greed which might cause them to mislead others or to lead others to engaging in harmful activities and behaviors. And here he also points out, one should see, is what the monk is teaching the sort of teachings which are difficult for a greedy person to understand? So for example, teachings on renunciation. Very difficult for a greedy person to understand the value of renunciation. Very difficult for them to practice renunciation. Very difficult for them to see the benefits of committing to renunciation. So if a monk is living a life of renunciation and teaching the blessings of renunciation, that's a pretty good indication that their mind is not too dominated by greed. They probably still have some greed, maybe, maybe not. But it's an indication they're not completely overwhelmed by greed, which is a sign that they're not likely to mislead people about what is true and what is not true. And the next thing he says, when examining him, if they see that he is pure of mind states based on greed, next they examine him to see if he has mind states based on aversion. And one does the same investigation. Is he overcome by aversion such that he might say, I know, when he does not know, etc. Finally, when examining him, they see that he is pure of mind states based on aversion. Next, they examine him to see if he has mind states based on delusion. And again, the same thing. Is he overcome by delusion such that he might say, I know, when he does not know, and so on. And they see the Dhamma that he teaches is not easy for a delusional person to teach. Again, delusional people don't make particularly good teachers. Then the Buddha makes a statement. After this, we'll stop there and we'll give more explanation tomorrow. He says, when examining him, they see that he is pure of mind states based on delusion. Their faith in him becomes settled. So at this point, they have faith in this monk because they've seen that he's free of coarse greed, hatred, and delusion, which might cause him to mislead or misguide others. So their faith in him becomes settled. Faithful, they approach him. Approaching him, they attend to him. Attending to him, they listen to him. Listening to him, they hear the Dhamma. Hearing the Dhamma, they remember it. Remembering the Dhamma, they investigate its meaning. Investigating the meaning of the Dhamma, they gain approval of the Dhamma based on contemplation. Where there is approval of that Dhamma based on contemplation, then they get interested. Interested, they try it. Having tried it, they evaluate it. Having evaluated it, they commit to it. Being self-committed, they personally realize the highest truth, for they have made a breakthrough and see it with wisdom. Bharadvaja, in this way there is awakening to truth. In this way one awakens to truth. In this way we indicate awakening to truth. However, this is not yet attainment of truth. So we'll stop there. So tomorrow we'll go through the final section on attainment of truth. But for now, I think it's time to switch to discussion. So please, if you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and enter them in, and we'll have some discussion around this part of the sutta.
Thank you, Bhante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And welcome to a few friends who have joined us in the meanwhile. Hello, Ishan, Elaine, and Bradley, and Jen, who says, "We missed you guys. Good morning, Venerables." And there's no questions just yet, or comments, but we can give people a bit of time. But it's interesting, now that I'm rereading this sutta, of how there's the sort of, it breaks it down in terms of the different stages of faith, hearing the Dhamma, remembering the Dhamma, investigating the Dhamma, then approval of the Dhamma based on contemplation, trying it, evaluating it.
Yeah, I find the sequence really beautiful. And we'll go over this tomorrow because I won't have enough time to really thoroughly explain this sequence, because the sequence is delightful.
Yeah.
And it's there's a number of places in the suttas where the Buddha gives a progressive sequence, starting with somebody who has no faith in the teachings and doesn't practice, leading all the way up through the gradual development of their faith and their practice until they attain awakening. And this particular formulation is not one of the common ones, but it's one which I find really wonderful. Yeah, we'll go over this in detail tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
So that's last paragraph there is the teaser.
Can't wait until tomorrow.
But one thing that I find really lovely about the middle part of the sutta, what we covered today, is the Buddha does make this distinction of protecting truth.
Mm-hmm.
So he makes this thing of, well, if you believe something, it's perfectly fine to say you believe something, but it's not fine to say that it's true. Again, if I believe that the world is flat, it's fine to say I believe the world is flat. It's not fine to say the world definitely is flat. So it's making that sharp distinction between making a statement about truth versus making a statement about what you believe to be true.
Yeah, they're all like parts of the process to get to truth. So.
Yeah. So that's actually a huge step, recognizing that our beliefs are just beliefs. They're not necessarily reflective of reality. And again, the Buddha's making a big difference between something you directly experience versus something you just believe. Even if your belief seems to be very logical or to make a lot of sense, it's still just a belief.
Right, but it starts anyway by taking it as a working hypothesis. So if it's something then tangible that you can actually prove it to yourself as truth, you still have to go through all those different stages.
Yeah.
Great. And Michael was saying, I will do a little look into the Pali, but right now I think our use of the English word understand shows how weak English is in conveying the subtlety of its meaning. I wonder if our protagonist's age helps him to be open to Buddha's teachings. That shows that we should always leave room to adjust belief. Holding on to belief is a problem. Trust me, I know I love my beliefs.
Yeah, we should always be willing to question our beliefs. And always be willing to examine, what is it? What beliefs do we have that we don't even recognize as beliefs? What beliefs do we have which we believe in so deeply that we don't see that it's just a belief? So always questioning our beliefs, but also always asking, what is it we have that is in fact a belief rather than a direct experience? So always looking more closely at our worldview, at our opinions, really trying to dig apart what there is based upon direct experience and what is perhaps more flimsy.
And Jens is asking, Bhante, can you discuss the role of Saddha until we have direct experience of the truth?
That actually fits better with tomorrow, because that's what this whole next section is on. But briefly speaking, as someone was saying, taking something on as a working hypothesis. So we do actually have a certain amount of direct experience, by the way. It's usually limited, but this is one of the things about the Dhamma, is that practicing the Dhamma gets immediate results, which are immediately visible. They're not necessarily complete enlightenment, but you can still see some effect. So, for example, the Buddha says, desire causes suffering. Well, is that true? Look at your own experience. When your mind is filled with desire, is there suffering? Well, yeah, you can see it for yourself. When you let go of that desire, even a little bit, does the suffering diminish even a little bit? Yeah, it does. So maybe you don't yet have full enlightenment, but you do have some experience, some direct confirmation of the Four Noble Truths. So that little tiny partial experience, which is a direct confirmation, can allow you to extrapolate that the Four Noble Truths probably apply on a larger, more complete scale as well. So that is a function of faith, but it's faith based upon some modicum of experience, some fragmentary experience. So it's not baseless faith. It's not like you pick up a book and the book says the world is flat, and you're like, oh, right, I will now believe the world is flat. It's not like that. You actually look at your mind and you see, oh, wow, the Buddha was right. When my mind is filled with desire, it's really uncomfortable. Oh, wow, the Buddha was right. When I let go of my desires, my mind gets a bit happier and calmer. So it's direct experience, which then leads to an arising of faith, which gives you some stable ground of confidence from which you can start taking on other aspects of the Dhamma as hypotheses, as working hypotheses, as something which you can start experimenting with, trying out. And from that, then there can arise faith. Okay?
Thank you, Bhante. It's also interesting how the Buddha talks about approaching, basically, from the point of view of a layperson, approaching a spiritual practitioner and examining their mind in a way that, like whether they're actually claiming that they see, that they have experienced truth in a false way, and also whether they're encouraging others to do unwholesome actions as a basis to then put faith, like it seems like it's the preliminary work to be done before putting faith into someone.
Yeah, and also note again that the Buddha is saying that we should investigate teachers. We shouldn't just place our faith in somebody just because they're wearing a robe, or just because they're not wearing a robe, or just because they run a big wealthy organization, or just because of any reason actually. But rather we should examine them in terms of their purity of mind and their purity of conduct, and to what effect their teachings have on people. Whether it leads people to be more virtuous or less virtuous. Whether their teachings lead people to benefit or to harm. So again, this indicates the practicality of the Buddha's approach. The Buddha doesn't say, oh, just find someone and place faith in them and do whatever they say. And that would just be absurd. That would be foolish. Rather, he's saying you should carefully examine and investigate a teacher's conduct and their teachings and the effects it has on their students before you place faith in them.
Yeah, which also I'm thinking, actually, even within Buddhism, when we hear about less than optimal skillful behavior in that has happened in some organizations, sort of this suggestion of the Buddha is very useful in kind of understanding, making the determination. Like, for example, if this teacher is claiming to have certain realizations that they haven't, but their conduct seems different than their claims. And on top of that, their influence on their students or their influence on others around them. So when, for example, all the cases of abuse of students, and so really seeing just, okay, if that's an unwholesome effect, then that is clearly not appropriate.
Yeah.
Very to the point. It's interesting. Whenever one rereads the suttas, always sees new meanings and new things.
Yeah, I found it really interesting. I was talking to Bhante Ji once, Bhante Gunaratana, and he was telling me that he's constantly rereading the suttas. And I asked him why. I'm like, surely you know the suttas inside and out by now. And he says, every time I reread the suttas, I learn something new. And this is from a 95-year-old monk who's been ordained since he was a teenager and has read the suttas probably hundreds of times by now. And he says, every time I reread them, I learn something new.
All right, and I think that's all for the questions today, this morning. I suspect that tomorrow we'll have a lot more questions once we'll be covering the last part of the sutta. And so we'll be meeting again tomorrow, same time, same place on YouTube. And this evening, we will be meeting as usual at 7:30 p.m. New York City time for chanting, meditation, and Dhamma discussion. And tomorrow evening, there will be monk chat. So any questions you have related to Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, you can bring them to the chat and we'll try our best to answer your questions. All right, so we can end the morning with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May all beings attain awakening.